Detroit, the Motor City. Once the beating heart of American industry, a place where auto plants roared day and night, turning steel and sweat into the machines that defined an era. But now, the silence is deafening. General Motors, the giant that put countless families into stable middle-class lives, is shutting down plants, one after another. And with every closure, thousands of workers are left staring at an uncertain future, wondering if the city that built America's cars is finally running out of gas. The numbers are staggering. Communities that thrived for decades on GM paychecks are collapsing almost overnight. Entire neighborhoods, once filled with proud auto workers, are now dotted with for sale signs and shuttered storefronts. Families who spent generations on the assembly line suddenly find themselves without a lifeline, without health care, without pensions strong enough to weather the storm. And the painful question lingers in every conversation across Michigan. If GM can't survive in Detroit, what does that mean for the city that gave birth to the automobile industry itself? This isn't just about one company trimming costs. It's about globalization, automation, and corporate decisions that value stock buybacks over American workers. GM executives argue that shifting production overseas and investing in electric vehicles is the future. But for the thousands of men and women who clocked in every morning at factories in Hamtramck, Lordstown, and beyond, that future looks more like abandonment than progress. The assembly lines that once symbolized American strength now sit cold, gathering dust, while workers line up at unemployment offices, trying to figure out how to put food on the table. For Detroit, this feels like déjà vu. The city already endured one of the worst economic collapses in American history when manufacturing jobs evaporated in the late 20th century. Entire blocks were abandoned. Crime soared. Families fled. And just when it seemed like Detroit was clawing its way back with revitalization projects, new investments, and a growing cultural scene, GM's closures rip open old wounds and reignite fears that the Motor City may never truly recover. But here's the deeper story. These closures aren't just hurting Detroit. The ripple effects stretch across the entire Midwest. Suppliers who built parts for GM are going under. Truck drivers who hauled auto components are losing contracts. Local diners and shops that depended on factory workers are closing their doors. A single GM plant closure doesn't just kill thousands of jobs, it destabilizes entire regional economies. And as more plants are shuttered, America is forced to confront a harsh reality. Can we even call Detroit the auto capital anymore? The human toll is impossible to ignore. Imagine giving 30 years of your life to a company, sacrificing weekends, holidays, missing family milestones, only to be handed a severance package and a vague, "thank you for your service." Workers who once walked with pride through plant gates now feel discarded like old parts. Many of them don't have the luxury of retraining for tech jobs or relocating to states where auto plants still operate. Their skills were built on the assembly line, and without that, they're left stranded. For younger workers, the closures destroy the promise of stability their parents once enjoyed. The dream of a good-paying union job with solid benefits is evaporating right before their eyes. And what makes the sting even sharper is the timing. GM has posted billions in profits in recent years. Their executives take home bonuses the size of entire neighborhoods' annual wages. Yet, while shareholders celebrate, the people who actually built the cars are shown the door. To many, it feels less like an economic necessity and more like corporate betrayal. Workers argue, how can a company call itself American when it abandons the very communities that made it strong? Politicians, of course, swoop in with promises. Some vow to bring manufacturing back. Others say the future lies in electric vehicles, new factories, and green technology. But those promises are years away from reality. For families losing their income today, tomorrow doesn't pay the bills. And the cruel irony: many of the new EV plants are being built outside of Detroit, sometimes even outside of the country. The Motor City, the birthplace of the modern automobile, is being left behind in the very revolution it helped create. Yet beneath all this pain, there's still a pulse in Detroit. People here are resilient. They've seen collapse before. They've fought back from bankruptcy, from abandoned streets, from a city once written off as dead. Community groups are rallying, unions are demanding accountability, and small businesses are pushing to reinvent the local economy. But the question that hangs in the air is whether resilience alone is enough this time, or whether the latest wave of GM closures represents a final chapter in Detroit's century-long story as the beating heart of American industry. The national implications are just as alarming. When GM shutters plants in Detroit, it sends a chilling signal to every industrial town across America. If the country's largest automaker, once the symbol of made in the USA, is abandoning its own roots, what hope do smaller manufacturers have? Cities like Flint, Toledo, and Dayton are watching closely, fearing they might be next. Every closure creates a domino effect, not only wiping out jobs but also eroding faith in America's ability to sustain its own industries. And while companies talk about efficiency and global competitiveness, ordinary Americans are left asking, competitive for whom? Meanwhile, foreign competitors are seizing the opportunity. Automakers in Asia and Europe are aggressively expanding production, investing in innovation, and capturing markets that once belonged to Detroit. For decades, the Big Three dominated the global stage. Today, they're struggling to hold ground. Each plant that closes gives rivals more leverage, more influence, and more reasons for consumers worldwide to turn away from American cars. The story of Detroit's decline is no longer just local, it's part of a global power shift in the auto industry. And let's not forget the cultural blow. Cars aren't just machines in America, they're identity, freedom, and tradition. GM wasn't simply a corporation, it was a cornerstone of the American dream. Families took pride in building Chevrolets, Buicks, and Cadillacs, knowing their work rolled down highways from coast to coast. Now, with factories shutting down, that pride is being replaced by bitterness. It's a wound that goes deeper than economics. It strikes at the heart of American identity. But while the closures devastate workers, there's another side to this story that cannot be ignored: automation. Even if GM kept plants in Detroit, the rise of robotics means fewer human hands on the line. For executives, robots don't demand wages, pensions, or health care. For workers, it means their decades of experience can be replaced by a machine in seconds. So even if production stays in America, the question remains: how many jobs will truly survive the technological revolution? Automation looms like a shadow over every conversation in Detroit. Walk into any modern auto plant and you'll see it: rows of robotic arms moving with precision, sparks flying as machines weld and assemble with tireless accuracy. For management, it's a dream: faster production, fewer errors, lower costs. But for the human worker, it's a nightmare. Every new robot on the line represents a paycheck lost, a family destabilized, and a community pushed closer to the edge. Workers can't compete with machines that never sleep, never strike, and never demand fair treatment. And here's the bitter irony: many of the very workers now displaced were once the champions of American innovation. Their parents and grandparents helped perfect the assembly line, turning Detroit into the world's industrial powerhouse. But the next chapter of that same innovation doesn't include them. The assembly line, once their lifeline, is now their replacement. This isn't just job loss, it's a rewriting of the social contract between corporations and the people who built them. As automation tightens its grip, the debate gets louder. Should America embrace the efficiency at any cost, or fight to preserve human labor even in industries where machines outperform people? It's a question with no easy answer. Some argue that automation frees up workers for new, higher-skilled jobs. But in cities like Detroit, where entire generations trained for factory life, the transition isn't smooth. A 50-year-old auto worker doesn't simply pivot into coding or robotics engineering overnight. The gap between theory and reality is crushing families right now. And this brings us to the political battlefield. Lawmakers are under immense pressure to respond, some calling for tariffs to keep jobs in America, others pushing for massive retraining programs, and still others insisting that GM and the auto giants should be penalized for abandoning workers while rewarding shareholders. Every election cycle, Detroit becomes a symbol in campaign speeches, a reminder of promises made and broken. Yet the plants keep closing, the jobs keep vanishing, and the people left behind wonder if politicians are more interested in their votes than their futures. The political clashes are fierce and growing louder with every plant closure. On one side, leaders demand accountability, accusing GM of betraying the very workers who carried it through crises like the 2008 financial collapse. They remind the public that taxpayers bailed out GM when the company was on the brink, saving it from bankruptcy. Now, those same taxpayers, many of whom once worked in GM factories, are left wondering, where is the loyalty in return? On the other side, politicians defend the closures as necessary adjustments, pointing to the global shift toward electric vehicles and clean energy. They argue that clinging to the past will only drag America further behind in the global race. But the workers don't see it that way. To them, this isn't about adjustments or transitions. It's about survival. Their frustration turns into protests outside shuttered factories, union halls filling with voices demanding answers, picket lines forming in the bitter cold. They chant about broken promises, corporate greed, and a government that too often talks about protecting workers but rarely delivers. The anger is raw, and it isn't limited to Detroit. Communities across the Midwest are rallying, realizing that what's happening in Michigan today could happen in Ohio, Indiana, or Illinois tomorrow. The unions are once again stepping into the spotlight, much like they did in the mid-20th century when they secured higher wages, health care, and retirement benefits for millions. But this time, the fight feels even harder. Instead of just pushing back against corporate power, unions are battling an entire global system of trade, automation, and economic forces that seem impossible to stop. The question is whether organized labor still has the strength to force companies like GM to reconsider, or if the balance of power has shifted permanently in favor of the boardrooms. And while debates rage in Washington, families back home can't wait for policies to trickle down. Parents are making brutal choices. Do they pull their kids out of college because tuition is suddenly unaffordable? Do they sell the house they've lived in for decades just to stay afloat? Do they abandon Detroit entirely in search of opportunity elsewhere, knowing they may never return to the city their families built? Every decision carries the weight of generations, and every option feels like a loss. For the families, the struggle is painfully real and immediate. Picture a household where 3 generations once worked under the same GM banner: a grandfather who retired with pride, a father who spent decades on the line, and a son who believed he'd carry on the tradition. Suddenly, the plant closes, and that legacy is ripped away. The father scrambles to find work that pays half of what he earned before, while the son packs his bags, moving out of state in search of opportunity, leaving behind the city his family called home for nearly a century. What was once a stable foundation now feels like quicksand. The ripple effects touch every corner of life. Grocery stores lose customers, forcing layoffs of their own. Teachers in Detroit schools see classrooms emptying as families leave in search of jobs. Local diners that thrived on the steady lunch rush from plant workers now sit nearly empty, their owners watching decades of hard work evaporate. Even churches, once filled with auto workers and their families on Sundays, are struggling to keep doors open as donations dwindle. These closures don't just dismantle an economy, they unravel the social fabric of entire communities. And the emotional toll is just as heavy. Parents are weighed down by guilt, worried they can't provide the stability their children deserve. Young adults who once dreamed of working their way up in GM now view the auto industry with mistrust, convinced there's no future for them in it. Pride has been replaced with shame, optimism with fear. In Detroit, conversations around the dinner table no longer revolve around overtime shifts and pay raises. They're filled with worries about foreclosure, medical bills, and whether tomorrow will be any better than today. But even as hardship deepens, there are sparks of resilience. Families are adapting in ways they never imagined, starting small businesses out of their garages, taking on multiple side hustles, or banding together with neighbors to share resources. Some are turning to local trade schools, retraining for new careers in healthcare, technology, or skilled trades that still need human hands. It's survival mode, yes, but it's also proof that even when institutions abandon them, the spirit of Detroit refuses to die. Detroit's broader reinvention is unfolding in real time, and it's a story filled with both hope and tension. The city knows it cannot depend solely on GM anymore. The closures made that painfully clear. So, new industries are slowly taking root. Tech startups, renewable energy firms, and small-scale manufacturers are moving into abandoned warehouses, trying to breathe life back into spaces once dominated by roaring assembly lines. Entrepreneurs are turning Detroit into a hub for creativity, from custom bike shops to urban farming projects that convert vacant lots into sources of food and income. But this reinvention comes with a sharp divide. The new opportunities don't always reach the same families devastated by GM's decisions. Many of the jobs popping up in tech or green energy require skills that displaced auto workers simply don't have. While young professionals from out of state move in to be part of Detroit's comeback story, lifelong residents often feel left out of the narrative. They see trendy cafes opening downtown and gleaming new apartments rising near the riverfront, but in their own neighborhoods, schools are closing, houses are crumbling, and jobs remain scarce. It raises a haunting question. Is Detroit really being reborn, or is it just being remade for someone else? Yet, despite the inequality of the recovery, the fight to redefine Detroit's identity is relentless. Community leaders push for programs that connect laid-off workers with training in emerging industries. Nonprofits launch initiatives to support families in crisis, while activists demand that any new investment prioritize local residents over outside developers. The struggle is intense, but it reflects a truth Detroit has lived with for decades. Survival isn't passive, it's a fight. And through it all, GM's shadow looms large. The closures serve as both a scar and a reminder of what the city once was. Every attempt at reinvention carries echoes of the past, as if Detroit is torn between honoring its legacy as the Motor City and forging a new future beyond the automobile. The question is whether the city can strike that balance, or whether the ghosts of plant closures will haunt its every step forward. Detroit's reinvention is colliding head-on with GM's aggressive push into electric vehicles and overseas production. On paper, the shift looks like progress: cleaner cars, cutting-edge technology, and a chance for America to lead the green revolution. But in reality, it feels like a double-edged sword for Detroit. While GM announces multi-billion-dollar investments in EV plants, many of those facilities are being built far from the neighborhoods still reeling from closures. Some are in the South, where labor is cheaper and unions hold less power. Others are outside the country altogether, giving workers in Mexico or China the very jobs that once sustained generations of Detroit families. For the people left behind, it's salt in the wound. They see commercials promising a bold new future of American innovation, but when they look around their own communities, the factories are silent, and the opportunities have passed them by. The irony is almost unbearable. Detroit, the birthplace of the automobile, is watching the next era of auto manufacturing unfold without it. Instead of leading the charge, the city risks becoming a relic, a monument to an industry that moved on. This global shift raises another painful reality. Detroit's decline isn't happening in isolation. America as a whole is losing ground in the manufacturing race. Countries like China, South Korea, and Germany are pouring resources into their auto industries, not only dominating production but also shaping the future of mobility itself. Electric vehicles, battery technology, and autonomous driving, these are the frontiers of tomorrow, and if America can't keep up, it risks becoming dependent on foreign innovation for something it once proudly owned. The consequences stretch beyond economics. National security experts warn that losing control over auto production, and the supply chains that fuel it, weakens America's independence. If batteries and key components come from overseas, then every American driver is tied to the decisions of foreign governments and corporations. What started as a GM plant closure in Detroit spirals into a bigger question. Is America surrendering its industrial backbone to the rest of the world? The global competition is intensifying, and America's slipping grip on manufacturing dominance is becoming impossible to ignore. Look at China, where government-backed automakers are scaling production at breakneck speed, flooding global markets with affordable electric vehicles. Europe, too, is investing heavily in green technologies, positioning countries like Germany to remain at the forefront of engineering excellence. Meanwhile, the U.S., once the unquestioned leader of the auto world, is scrambling to catch up, weighed down by plant closures, fractured supply chains, and corporate strategies that prioritize short-term profits over long-term vision. For decades, Detroit set the standard. Foreign automakers studied American assembly lines, learned from them, and then built their own empires. Now, the roles are reversed. American executives are touring overseas plants, trying to understand how competitors manage to produce cars faster, cheaper, and with greater innovation. The phrase, "made in the USA," once carried pride and strength. Today, it risks becoming an afterthought in a world dominated by "made in China" or "engineered in Germany." And this isn't just about cars, it's about the broader question of America's future in the global economy. Manufacturing has always been the backbone of national power, the foundation that supports everything from jobs to military strength. When GM shutters plants, it's not only eliminating paychecks, it's eroding America's capacity to compete on the world stage. Every closure chips away at the country's industrial might, leaving it more dependent on foreign factories for products it once built proudly at home. The warning signs are clear. If the U.S. continues down this path, it risks becoming a consumer nation rather than a producer nation, relying on imports to fuel its economy while its own factories rust away. And for cities like Detroit, this transformation feels like betrayal. They didn't just build cars, they built the American identity. To see that legacy outsourced is more than an economic blow, it's a cultural and national wound that cuts deep. The decline is striking hardest at America's workers and the middle class, the very backbone of the country. For much of the 20th century, a factory job at GM wasn't just employment, it was a ticket to stability. With union protection, fair wages, and strong benefits, workers could buy homes, send their kids to college, and retire with dignity. That was the promise of the American middle class, and it was built on the strength of manufacturing. But every plant closure shatters that promise a little more. Families that once thrived on steady paychecks are now juggling multiple low-wage jobs just to scrape by, and the sense of upward mobility, the idea that each generation would do better than the last, is slipping away. This hollowing out of the middle class doesn't just hit individual households, it reshapes entire communities. Towns that once boasted thriving schools, bustling main streets, and stable property values are turning into hollow shells. Tax bases shrink, public services decline, and crime creeps in where opportunity once lived. The factory gate that once symbolized security now stands as a reminder of how fragile the American dream has become. And it's not just Detroit. This pattern stretches across Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and beyond. The industrial heartland of America, once called the arsenal of democracy, is being hollowed out, leaving behind uncertainty and despair. But here's the bigger danger. When the middle class collapses, the entire nation feels it. Consumer spending weakens, inequality widens, and political divides deepen. America's strength has always come from its vast, stable middle class, the millions of workers who could afford homes, cars, and a better life. Without them, the country risks becoming a two-tiered society, a wealthy elite profiting from global trade and automation, and a struggling majority left behind in the ruins of closed plants and abandoned towns. And as the middle class shrinks, so does national confidence. People begin to question not only their futures but the very system that promised them security in exchange for hard work. That disillusionment breeds anger, frustration, and division, fueling political movements that shake the foundations of American society. A GM plant closure, then, is never just about cars. It's about the unraveling of a social contract that defined the United States for generations. That unraveling of the middle class is fueling a storm of political and social unrest across the country. When people lose faith in the promise of hard work leading to stability, they turn their frustration outward. Protests outside shuttered factories aren't just about jobs. They're about dignity, about the feeling of being discarded by a system that once relied on them. Workers chant not only against GM but against politicians who made grand promises of bringing jobs back and failed to deliver. The anger spills into elections, fueling movements on both the left and the right, each claiming to have the answer to America's manufacturing decline. In communities hit hardest by closures, this unrest becomes a daily reality. Families talk less about the future and more about survival. Neighborhoods that once rallied around local factories are now divided between those who want protectionist policies to force companies like GM to stay and those who believe only innovation and globalization can save the economy. This split fuels cultural tension, with each side blaming the other for the collapse of the American dream. The sense of betrayal runs deep. Many workers remember how, during the 2008 crisis, America stepped in to rescue GM with taxpayer money, only for the company to later slash jobs and expand overseas. That history lingers like a scar. People ask, if loyalty is a one-way street, if corporations can abandon communities once they've extracted every ounce of labor and tax breaks, then what is left to hold the nation together? And it's not just rhetoric, it's action. Town hall meetings are overflowing with residents demanding accountability. Union strikes flare up with a new intensity, fueled by desperation rather than strategy. Social movements are building momentum, calling for everything from universal basic income to sweeping labor reforms. The closures have ignited a debate far larger than the auto industry. They've forced America to confront whether the current economic system still works for its people or if it's time for something radically different. Detroit's story is more than just about cars, more than just about GM. It's a mirror reflecting the future of America itself. If a city that once defined innovation, power, and prosperity can fall this far, what does that say about the path the nation is heading down? The closures aren't just about lost jobs, they're about lost trust, lost identity, and a shrinking middle class that once held this country together. But make no mistake, Detroit isn't dead. Its people have survived collapse before, and they may rise again, reinventing themselves in ways no corporation could predict. Yet the question remains, will America learn from Detroit's struggle, or will it allow the same fate to spread across every industrial town from coast to coast? The future of Detroit isn't just Detroit's, it's America's. And the clock is ticking.